We didn't just provide to you, though, the facts of this case to prove this question to you, but we brought you witness after witness in every stage of his life and every part of his life to show you what kind of person this defendant is. And now you know. He's a manipulator. He's a liar. He won't change. And quite frankly, he doesn't want to change. And so you look at this question with that in mind, and you think about probability. It doesn't ask, is it a certainty, but is it a probability that he would commit criminal acts of violence? And we talked about what are criminal acts of violence. And remember in voir dire, Judge Velasquez told you it could be something like throwing a chair against a wall. It could be a threat to a guard. It could be an assault, but it doesn't have to be an assault with first aid, and it doesn't have to be a murder. It's criminal acts of violence. And this defendant has already provided you his resume because we talked about what's the best predictor of future behavior. It's past behavior. Look at his resume. And then you look at continuing threat to society. And we talked about what is society. And you got an opportunity to hear from Bonnie Fivish, the classifications expert that's been with the Texas Department of Corrections for 27 years. And what did she tell you that is so important? Did she tell you that this defendant's going to go in and be segregated? Absolutely not. You know that he's going to go into general population as a G3, which means he's going to have access to teachers and chaplains and nurses and doctors and inmates. And you know that he's a manipulator. And I am sure that there are plenty of inmates in there that are more than willing to do his bidding for him. You also heard that if he goes to death row, it won't be like that. He won't have access to the internet. He won't have access to other inmates that way. He'll be watched. He'll be confined. And hopefully, maybe the target on the back of this family will maybe be just a little bit smaller with him on death row. You know how to answer this question. It's a yes. It's a yes. And so then you go to the second issue, issue number 2. Do you find that taking into consideration all of the evidence, whether there is anything sufficiently mitigating about this defendant? It can't just be mitigating. We talked about that. It has to be sufficiently mitigating. And I submit to you that being a Boy Scout and taking an ugly girl to prom doesn't even meet the threshold for sufficiently mitigating. And so, therefore, the answer to that question is no. We have been waiting for this moment to come to you since the judge read out your verdict just a couple weeks ago. We have been ready for this moment to talk to you about these special issues and go through them with you. Because we know that this is a case that you all will never forget. This is a case that will be forever seared in your mind. It's one of those. We told you at the beginning that this was a case about a plan that was created in anger and fueled by vengeance. And we proved to you that he started the plan. Katie? Stephen? Cassidy? Brian? Emily? Rebecca? Zach? But the plan is not complete. Roger, Melanie, Jared, Mary, Lydia, Jacob, Ari, Noki, Drew, Arlena, Adeline, Kyle, Aubrey, McKenna, Brock, Aubrey, Alex, Emma, Ethan, Neil, Kate. If not this, then what?
Defense? Know what you're deciding. Know the importance of what you're deciding. I know you do. But I think the state's trying to make it as simple as possible. And you know it's complicated. You know it's much more complicated. There's been lots of talk about death, and the death penalty is it's just push a button. And it's more than that. It's not pushing a button as part of a process. You're not part of this process. Okay? It's not being on that train tracks to death row. It's the law. And the law, as I said before, is black and white. All right? The law is the Constitution, and it guides us to become the society that we are. That we want to be civilized and humane. And you and I will follow the law. We're a country of laws, and I know you're going to follow the law today. 10 years from now, maybe you'll be buying a house. Maybe you'll be taking your daughter to piano practice. Maybe you'll be going to see your son play t-ball or plan a vacation to Disney World or the mountains or the beach. 20 years from now, maybe thinking about your kids in college, starting a second or third career, planning retirement. But day after day after day, Ron Haskell will be in prison, in a cell, thinking about what he's done, eating prison food, maybe seeing daylight 4 or 5 times a day, 4 or 5 hours a day. And we know this from the science. He won't be the one who will be a probable victim or probable perpetrator of violence. He'll probably be a victim of violence. Until his last breath, he will die in prison. And he deserves that without question. But right now, you're being asked to check 2 boxes to determine if we end his life. Vengeance. That's what the state wants you to do. If it was that easy, vengeance. That's why you convict. That's why you convicted him. You convicted him because of all of these bullets. The danger that he posed to the other individuals. The plan that he made to kill everyone here. Everybody. And what a plan it was. Driven by madness, driven by anger, driven by vengeance. And what happened? This happened. And you already determined that. These 6 good people were killed. And you determined that. And part of your verdict was maybe driven on vengeance. But that's not why we're here now in punishment. These were wonderful people. And I will talk about them, every one. These are some of the most fantastic people I've had the opportunity as a defense attorney to talk to. They've talked to me.
Objection, judges, is outside the record.
Sustained.
It's not about vengeance. It's about the law. And if it was that easy, if all you had to do was push a button and not look at these 2 issues, what would you be thinking? You would be thinking about the trauma, the horror that Cassidy endured, that Melanie endured. How this tragedy has affected their life. The life of the Lyons and the Stays. They would be thinking about Katie and Stephen and Brian and Becca and Emily and Zach. And you could just push the button. But that's not what it's about. That's not what the law is. That's the first part of the law that you have to determine. Do you find from the evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt, that there is a probability that the defendant, Ronald Lee Haskell, would commit criminal acts of violence, that would constitute a continuing threat to society? It doesn't say, could he be violent? It says, would he be violent? And it even goes beyond that. Would he continue to be violent? Would he commit criminal acts of violence that would constitute a continuing threat to society? And it's not our society, it's his society. A society that you determine by your verdict is going to be a prison cell. And you already know, in that society, he won't be a continuing threat. The science and the studies show that. Now, what did the state say? The state say it was this way with his family, therefore it will be this way in prison. Well, his family's not in prison. The studies and the science show that that is not a factor. He was a liar and a manipulator. That's not a continuing threat to society. That's part of his character. Part of his illness, maybe. But that's not a continuing threat to society. That he showed absolutely no remorse. One phone call out of over 200 phone calls, listened to by the state. And he told Bob, I just can't feel guilty. I don't feel guilty. Every doctor he talked to, he said he couldn't feel guilty. Well, is that about his mental illness? But does that show that he could be a continuing threat to society? To his society? They said in a 5-year period, in 1,825 days that he has been in jail, he had one markup. And that was on Castile. Do you really believe Castile? Do you think there was more to it than just that? I don't think the jail did. How do you know? How would you know that maybe the jail didn't know this? Well, Ron Haskell threatened Castile, unshackled, out of his cell, face-to-face, threatened to kill him with a knife, take a shank to his ear when he's turned around. He threatened him more than once. He threatened him after they put him back in his cell. The Rovers came and put him back in his cell. Threatened him again. Did the jail take it seriously? They didn't search his cell. They didn't search him. They kept him in his cell, and they transferred Castillo. And what did he get? What did Ronald Haskell get? 5 days loss of privileges of commissary. The jail didn't think he was a continuing threat any longer. They didn't think he was a continuing threat. You know why? Because after that happened, God bless you, they let him go back out to the common area with 10 other inmates, unshackled, with other guards. The jail, with decades of experience dealing with thousands, hundreds of thousands of people over years and years, didn't feel that he was a continuing threat to society. But according to the state, this shows a continuing threat. Remember in voir dire, as Misconduct just said, a criminal act of violence could be throwing a chair up against a wall. We don't even see that. We see one threat. That's a prison environment where he is contained and controlled. What did the state really present? They presented a TDC person, Ms. Fibish, who essentially told you that TDC was incompetent, that he would be housed with other offenders in the same type of uniform, housed with offenders with lesser crimes, and that he would pose a danger to them. That he'd able to get a job, maybe in a kitchen, and have access to knives. And doctors and teachers and chaplains and other inmates could get stabbed. That there was a chance, a possibility, not a probability, a possibility that he could escape and then finish the job. That Ms. Fibish told you there are murders and assaults and sexual assaults, and she said she had no statistics, but it happens. You know she had statistics. They showed the statistics to Dr. Cunningham. Remember when Dr. Cunningham testified? And they brought the statistics up there and they talked about them. Chunking, 711 incidents. Serious staff assault, 92 incidents. Serious offender assaults, where they go to the hospital, 1,355 incidents. Escapes, 12. One per year. Dr. Cunningham tried to say, okay, well, those statistics, but what they didn't tell you was that those statistics apply to over 100,000 inmates in TDC. So the worst number, 1,355 incidents of serious offender assaults, is 0.00135. And they didn't even break it down into the science. They just gave these numbers as if that applies to Ron Haskell. That's anecdotal. Do you remember the different levels that Dr. Cunningham said, this is the different level of assessments, of analysis that we conduct that's scientific? The highest being actuarial. Anecdotal was at the bottom. And we all know that past violent behavior does not predict future violent behavior. We know that from the studies and from the science. Now, what else did they present you? They presented you with person after person, family and friends who testified how much this tragedy has affected them. I can't even imagine how this has affected them. We couldn't fathom that. You heard evidence and talked about how wonderful people, these people were wonderful people, talked about how wonderful Katie and Stephen and Brian and Becca and Emily and Zach and Cassie. Every one of us, I assure you, would have loved to meet them. But what is all that about? Is that about future danger? They present They presented once again, and they will present you once again what he did. What happened on July 9th, 2014? Which is horrible. That's not part of the decision you have to make. That testimony and all that evidence that the state put on was all about vengeance. It was all geared toward guilt. You've already made that decision. And you determined, rightly so, that Ron Haskell is guilty. And he shouldn't see the light of day. Vengeance is not the law. If vengeance was the law, I may not be here arguing. But there is a law. It's not a button you push. That's the law. Do you find from the evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt, there's a probability that Ron Haskell would commit criminal acts of violence that would constitute a continuing threat to society? That's the law. Not this. We brought you the science, we brought you the studies. We brought you the best mitigation we can get you. Mr. Durham's going to talk about mitigation. I'm here to talk about future danger. But we know from the evidence that he's not a future danger. We know from the science and studies that he could spend the rest of his life in prison. You cannot have vengeance as part of your decision. The sad part of this is this. The state's theory is that Ron Haskell, out of vengeance, out of vindictiveness, out of anger, out of a process, killed the states. And they want you to do the same here. Out of anger, out of vengeance, out of vindictiveness, out of a process to push a button, which is no better than a murder, which is no better than Ron Haskell. Now, I explained to most of you all in Voir dire this, and I explained it in the closing of guilt innocence. And it's so important to have to explain this one more time to you before I sit down. This isn't a group verdict. This is one of the most important decisions you will have to make in your lives, probably. And it's your decision. It's your decision. And it's your decision, and only you make that decision. You and only you will take a look at this evidence. You and only you will remember what was said on the stand. You stand by that decision. You have the right. You stand by your belief. You have that right. Remember in Voir dire, I think I talked to almost every one of you. And every one of you promised to respect each other's decisions. So you stand by that decision, and your decision will be respected. Stand by your decision, the right decision. The answer to Special Issue 1 is no.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Durham, you may proceed.
In Gainesville, Texas, there's a beautiful live oak. It grows in the downtown square. Gainesville's up near the Oklahoma border. That tree is over 100 years old. The branches of that tree are magnificent. Some of them extend out almost as far as this courtroom. That live oak, that 100-year live oak, is a metaphor for life. But it's got a dark history. In 1862, a mob round up 14 people. They were suspected of being Unionists, opposed to slavery. And that mob took those 14 people and put ropes around their neck and hung them up and executed those people without a trial on the branches of that live oak. In theory, we've evolved as a society. Texas has evolved as a society from 1862. In 1862, that was Texas justice. We now afford and have afforded Ron Haskell a due process, a right to counsel, a right to cross-examine witnesses, and a jury trial. You have been impaneled as part of that due process to make the decision in this case, and what is Texas justice in the year 2019. But as I stand here before you, I'm very nervous. I'm nervous because I don't know that we have the capacity as human beings to be just in a case like this. You know, the most important instruction in this court's charge, in my view, is at page 2 and 3. You are instructed not to be swayed by mere sentiment, conjecture, sympathy, most important, passion or prejudice, public opinion or public feeling. My concern is, in a case like this, where children have been killed, do we have the human capacity to be reasonable, rational in our process? You know, in 30 minutes or so, when I sit down, these fine prosecutors are going to stand up and, using their words and their rhetoric and their skills as advocates for the Stay family, they are going to turn you into a lynch mob. You know, they'll disguise their arguments based on future danger, and they will disguise their arguments with the absence of any sufficiently mitigating circumstances. But you know, really at the heart of their argument is anger, hatred, fear, vengeance, because of this terrible, terrible crime that's happened. I anticipate, I may be wrong, but I anticipate they're going to put up pictures of that beautiful, beautiful Stay family. Katie, Stephen, Brian, Rebecca, Emily, and oh my God, Zach. They may show you pictures of the autopsy and the brutality of the acts of this man. Again, to turn you into that lynch mob, to stoke your emotions, your prejudices, anger, fear, vengeance, hatred for the acts. But you know, there's one unalterable, uncontrovertible fact. And the truth in this case is, by killing Ron Haskell, you're never going to eliminate the grief that the Stay family is going to have for the rest of their life. Killing Ron Haskell is not going to make that grief go away. It may make them feel better for a second, but that's not going to last. You know, Cassidy, Tom, Melanie, the friends and family of the Stays are going to have that grief every day for the rest of their lives. You know that. You heard that from the witness stand. And it's terrible. But killing Ron Haskell isn't going to change that. So let's talk about the law and the evolution of our criminal justice system. You know, in 2005, we created the legislature. And in fact, I'll just remind you that Dr. Cunningham was a part of that. He testified before the state legislature as a scientist about his studies and was instrumental in creating these special issues designed to create a rational, reasonable process in determining what's an appropriate punishment after you find a person guilty of capital murder. And I'm going to talk about mitigation, but I think it's important to talk about future danger. And you know, you've understood this. We talked about this at the very beginning of jury selection. I want to remind you, though, the burden of proof as to that first special issue, future danger, is on the state. They have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that there's a probability that Ronald Haskell would commit criminal acts of violence that would constitute a continuing threat to society. Now, probability is not defined, but I would suggest to you that in light of the burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt probability, it's more likely than not. It's reasonable certainty.
I'm
And
going to
you-
object. This is outside the record, and that's not what the law states.
I'll sustain the objection, we can continue.
There's no definition. It's what you interpret that to mean. But common sense suggests probability is more likely than not. It's not a possibility. And you've heard the testimony of Dr. Cunningham. He's a scientist. He's brought you his methodology. He's talked to you about the factors and the statistics and the data. And what has he told you? Let's talk about that for a minute. Past violence in the community is not strongly or consistently associated with prison violence. Current offense, prior convictions, escape history are only weakly associated with prison misconduct. He did a risk assessment, and he told you why there's a low probability that Ron Haskell will be a future danger in a prison society. Remember, it's context, and that's the context. Ron Haskell, by your verdict, is going to spend the rest of his life in prison without parole, unless you decide otherwise. So that's the context. And what did he tell you? He told you why Ron Haskell is likely to have to adjust to prison and why he's a low probability that he will commit criminal acts of violence. Well, he said severity of offense is not a good predictor of prison adjustment. The fact that Ron Haskell committed capital murder, killing Stephen Stay and Katie Stay and Rebecca, Brian, Emily, and Zach, is not a good predictor of prison adjustment. That's the data. That's the statistics. He also told you about age 39. The older inmates adjust to prison life better than young people, gang affiliations. He told you that the disciplinary infractions are a factor. The fewer disciplinary infractions, the more likely the person is not going to be a future danger. Ron had one disciplinary infraction during the 5 years that he was in prison. And Dr. Cunningham also said to you, you have to look at the correctional appraisal of that infraction. And he told you the jail categorized that as a minor offense and, canceled his commissary. That was the correctional appraisement that the jail made. He talked to you about education, the fact that Ron has a high school education and some trade school. Are the data. That's an indicator of whether he's going to be a future danger or not. Community employment history, the fact that he worked, had a work history. Some people who commit crimes don't have that. The continued contact with community members, his family, the fact that his family will write him letters and see him, that's a factor in terms of whether he's going to be a future danger, according to the data, the statistics, the science. He also told you that the severity of the offense is not a good predictor. Killing multiple victims during a domestic violent encounter is not indicative of whether he's going to be a future danger. The facts that and the law tells you to consider all of the evidence, but the facts that the state is bringing to you in order to warrant you finding future danger are the circumstances of the offense, which are not indicative of future danger. The multiple murders, the domestic violence context, the fact that he had domestic violence against Melanie, his mother, the other family members, that's not indicative, nor does that correlate, according to the data, to future danger. That's the science, that's the evidence. That's what you have to consider in deciding the future danger. Don't be sidetracked by the emotion, the fear, the hatred, the anecdotal evidence. The state wants to bring you a plane crash and make you afraid to fly. That's the example, the anecdotal example Dr. Cunningham told you about. You have to be rational and reasonable. That's the instructions you're given by the court. You have to render a true verdict according to the law and the evidence. So if you got, that's your bound duty. And there's no room for anger, emotion, vengeance. That's not your duty. And so if you're really true to your verdict, and you are rational and reasonable and consider the evidence, that answer has to be no. It's not a possibility. You know, Dr. Cunningham said he can never tell you there's no possibility, but that's not the standard. The standard is probability. And the evidence shows you there's no probability that Ron Haskell is going to be a future danger because of the data and the circumstances. You know, they didn't argue, well, you know, Dr. Cunningham, he's biased. He's only been called by the defense. I would submit to you, if I was a prosecutor and I had a young 18-year-old offender who was part of a gang, who had never worked, who had no family support, who had been in trouble, you know, every other week in the jail for assaulting people, I would call Dr. Cunningham and I would have him testify as to why that person's a future danger. Because the criteria in that case would show he's a future danger. But that's not the case in this case. That's not the facts, and the data and the science prove otherwise. Ron Haskell is not a future danger. So I would submit to you, you don't ever get to the mitigation issue. Why? Because the court instructs you in the court's charge. If you answer that he's not a future danger, that ends your deliberations. That's it. Life without parole. You don't ever get to the second mitigation issue. But I'm going to talk to you about mitigation. You know, and I'll be very candid with you. I argued that Ron Haskell had a severe mental illness and he couldn't distinguish right from wrong. And obviously you rejected that. And I don't quarrel with your verdict. I respect your verdict. So I don't know what you're thinking, and I don't know how my arguments are resonating with you. So I'm going to talk about mitigation, even though I don't think you should ever get there. So let's talk about mitigation. You know, I don't think anybody can reasonably or rationally consider the evidence in this case and not find that Ron Haskell had a severe mental illness. You know, even the state's experts, Dr. Proctor, Dr. Moeller, said he's got a severe mental illness. Well, he's got major depression. And yeah, that can be severe. And you remember the testimony at guilt or innocence, and you can consider the evidence, not only at guilt or innocence, but at punishment in determining your verdict in this case. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back again and talk to you about, Ron Haskell's hospitalizations from the summer of 2013 through up until June of 2014. Why? Because it's important. I stayed awake last night, went through, my notes, I did a database, and by my count, when you consider the number of doctors that saw Ron Haskell from the August of 2013 until June of 2014, there were, let me just look at my notes here. There were 14, at least 14 psychiatrists that saw him. And I'm going to run through this real quickly. In addition to the experts, Dr. Moeller, Dr. Proctor, they said he had a major depression. It's a mental illness. Dr. Raffel said he had bipolar disorder, a severe mental illness, certainly on July the 9th of 2014. But then in January of 2019, Dr. Raffel said it had moved into schizoaffective disorder, a severe mental illness. Dr. Resnick said he had major depression with psychotic features. And then you have Dr. Firth, who saw him, major depression, treated him with Celexa, September 13th, 2013 at the South Cache Clinic. Dr. Ringel saw him October the 28th and 29th at the Palomar Hospital. Diagnosis, major depression, treated him with Seroquel, antipsychotic. Dr. Rasmus and Dr. Merrill saw Ronald Haskell, September the 16th, 2013, September the 19th, 2013 at the Logan Regional Hospital. Diagnosis, major depression, treated him with antipsychotics. Dr. Sheath, Dr. Mize, Dr. Shagoza, Dr. Meldon saw Ronald Haskell from November the 13th to November 26th at the Tri-City Healthcare. Diagnosis, major depression, treated him with Abilify, antipsychotics. Dr. Abdullah and Dr. Malik at the County of San Diego, the Mental Health Services. Diagnosis, major depression, treatment, Abilify, antipsychotics. Dr. Campbell's notes from the office visits, he was a psychologist, remember, can't prescribe medicine, but he said he had bipolar disorder. He saw him from March, January the 13th of 2014 through March of 2014. Bipolar disorder was his diagnosis. Dr. Oshrin saw Ronald Haskell on April the 15th, 2014 at the Neighborhood Health Clinic. Diagnosis, major depression disorder with psychotic features. Treated him with Lamitrig, I'm mispronouncing that, 100 milligrams. It's an antipsychotic. Dr. Panacea saw Ron Haskell April the 19th to May the 1st of 2014. Helping Hand Clinic. Diagnosis, major depression. Treatment, Abilify. And then we move into the jail medical records and the number of psychiatrists that saw Ron from July 10th of 2014 until, present day. 10 psychiatrists at a minimum in the jail saw him. Look at those medical records that were, look at all of the medical records that are on the disc when you go back there and refresh your memory with all the medical records from August of 2013 to June of 2014 in California and Utah. Why? Because it's important as to the severe mental illness. But let's talk about, and look at Exhibit 21, which is a condensed, easier view of the medical records. But Dr. Rafiq, psychiatrist, saw Ron on July 10th, 2014. And, he describes, he hears people talk about different things when nobody's in the room. What does he diagnose him with? Major depression with psychotic features. He treats him with Risperidol, which is an antipsychotic. Look at page 2 and 4 of the Defense Exhibit 21. Look at that yourself and read it. Then you have, he again saw him in January the 25th of 2017. His diagnosis didn't change, major depression. This time he changed the antipsychotic to Zyprexa. 15 milligrams. Look at page 49 and 50 in Defense Exhibit 21. Then you have Dr. Athvale, psychiatrist, saw Ron Haskell on July the 20th, 2014. He, in his notes, says he admits to hearing voices, his thought contents, hallucinations, diagnosis, major depression, major depressive disorder with psychotic features, treatment, Zyprexa, antipsychotic. It's page 9 and 10 of Defense Exhibit 21. Dr. Ahuku saw Ron Haskell on July 31st, 2014. Still hears voices. Diagnosis, major depression disorder with severe psychotic features, treatment, Zyprexa, antipsychotic. Page 13 and 14 of Defense Exhibit 21. Dr. Leon, medical doctor, psychiatrist, saw Ron Haskell on September the 2nd, 2014 and September the 3rd of 2014. The admission diagnosis was major depressive disorder, severe, and then the discharge diagnosis was bipolar. And she makes the notes under treatment course. See the description. She says, patient appears to be in better spirits and more alert. Medications are helping him. Page 15. The patient has attended some group sessions in the 2P pod. Patient is in good mood and denies any psychosis and or thoughts of hurting himself. He has not been a behavior problem either. Discharge plan, transfer to general population. Page 15 and 16. So what's happened? From July 10th, 2014, up until September 3rd, 2014, the psychiatrists in the jail that saw Ron, they diagnosed him with severe mental illness. They were treating him with antipsychotics, and what happens? He starts getting better. So think about that. That's evidence in this case. Is that consistent with somebody who's malingering, making up his illness? No. During jury selection, you told us that you would consider the evidence of experts and psychiatrists. Well, you have it. And you're bound by your oath to consider it and weigh that evidence. Well, let's continue. Dr. Laborde, psychiatrist, saw Ron April the 17th of 2015, diagnosis major depression. Major depressive disorder with severe psychotic features, bipolar disorder. Patient has auditory hallucinations. Voices seem to come out of his head. One is Joseph. The voices seem to run commentaries on the patient's activities. Patient says olazepine, which is Zyprexa, helps the auditory hallucinations with the treatment. Well, they raised the Zyprexa from 15 milligrams to 25 milligrams. And we know from the testimony that Ron, he goes through periods where he's not compliant. He stops the meds for whatever reason, the side effects. Dr. Huerta saw Ron on April 29th of 2015. Diagnosis, bipolar disorder, psychotic symptoms, and mood dysregulation, mood swings, chronic anger and mania. That's page 26 and 28, Defense Exhibit 21. Dr. Warnerkey saw Ron May the 1st of 2015. Diagnosis, bipolar disorder. Most recent severe depressed mood swings, chronic anger, mania. Treatment, 25 milligrams daily of Zyprexa, an antipsychotic. Dr. Riaz, psychiatrist, medical doctor, saw Ron on May the 5th, 2015. Diagnosis, bipolar, depressed. Patient admitted for auditory hallucinations, depressed, suicidal ideations, mood dysregulation, mood swings, chronic anger, and mania. We know that. Treatment, antipsychotic, Zyprexa. That's at page 20 and 21, Defense Exhibit 21. Dr. Hansen saw Ron on June the 8th of 2016, major depressive disorder, severe with psychotic features, personal history noncompliance, treatment increase, Zyprexa 15 milligrams, patient improved compliance from last encounter, where he was refusing all medications, although still doing well, will increase the Zyprexa to 15 milligrams for now and follow up in 2 months. This is the Dr. Hansen who said, he was malingering. I'm a doctor, I have a Hippocratic oath to do no harm, but I don't believe him, he's malingering. And yet she continues to prescribe antipsychotics and suppression. I want to know who got to her. Maybe she knows about the killings. Maybe she's not biased.
That's outside the scope of the record. It's improper.
Overrule the objection, but
I submit that Dr. Hansen's credible, not
I'll
credible.
keep your ears open for any other objections from the defense. I'll let you go from the state, however, I'll let you continue.
Dr. Haskell saw Ron Haskell May the 25th of 2019. Noted, today patient reported that he's doing okay. Overall, though, feels depressed and anxious at times. He states he wants to stay on the Celexa because it has a positive benefit. Medical records. That's not in Defense Exhibit 21. I overlooked it, but it's in the disc. Look at it, April 25th, 2019. That evidence is not consistent with feigning mental illness, malingering. And remember also with regard to the hospitalizations from August of 2013 until June of 2014, even the state's own experts, Dr. Proctor and Dr. Moeller said, you remember the feigning criteria in the DSM-3 and DSM-4, where it says you have to look at the motive. There was no motive. They admitted no motive back in August 2013 through June of 2014. There's no motive for him to feign mental illness. The only conclusion that you can make is Ron Haskell has a severe mental illness. Now, what weight you assign to that severe mental illness, that's your decision. But I would submit to you it's mitigating. And why do I say that? Remember the testimony about severe mental illness. It's a biological brain disease. They don't know for sure what the cause is, but you remember the testimony from even the state's experts agree and admit that there is a dopamine theory. The dopamine theory is that there's too much dopamine in a psychotic brain. It affects the limbic regions of the brain, and the D2 receptors, transmitters get all out of whack because of too much dopamine. What does the antipsychotic medicine do? It suppresses the dopamine. So the receptors, the neurotransmitters work. So it reorganizes how the brain interprets data. Remember a psychotic brain, a touch is a sound. The brain neurotransmitters are messed up. It's real. Ron Haskell did not choose to have a severe mental illness. You remember Dr. Cunningham say, well, there's some volition in terms of Ron Haskell's conduct, but it's not free will. Why? Because his brain doesn't work properly. He's severely ill. So you have to consider that evidence in determining whether he should be held purely culpable. Isn't that a factor that reduces moral blameworthiness in this case? It's one thing for all of us to sit here and have healthy brains and pass judgment. I wonder how many of you know people that have a severe mental illness. You don't know what it's like. I know. I have experience
I'll
with
sustain
people.
the objection.
And I hope you know and know people that have had severe mental illnesses
I'll
because
sustain the objection. Let's move on.
it's real. And it reduces moral blameworthiness. I hope you would give it weight and to find a sufficient mitigating circumstance to warrant life in prison as opposed to the death penalty. In the Middle East, 19 years ago, a crowd of people were charged with the responsibility of judging a woman who'd committed a crime. And a voice stood up and looked at that crowd of people and say, "You who are without sin, cast the first stone." put down the stones, walk away. Have the emotions, if you're going to be controlled by emotion, of love and compassion and forgiveness, as opposed to hate, anger, and fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Durham, and rebuttal from state.
July 9th of 2014 wasn't just a bad day for him. It's a prime example of who he has always been and who he will always be. An abusive, angry, violent, manipulative, selfish, narcissist, blame-shifting monster. July 9th encapsulated all of that for you. But you've now had the opportunity to learn a lot more about his life and a lot more than just about July 9th. And you now know who he truly is and how he is never going to change. And what's worse, and what the evidence has shown you, is he doesn't want to. And that makes him infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more scary than most people. Because most people recognize when they cross over the line that they've crossed over the line. He didn't just cross over the line, he jumps over it. And then he looks back at you and says, "Judge me lest you be judged." He shifts blame. He manipulates. He doesn't accept responsibility. He has never accepted responsibility. Ever. Not one time for this. And I would encourage you to find anywhere where he's accepted responsibility for anything in his life. It's not there. And not only can he not accept responsibility for what he's done, but he can't feel bad about it. He shot 4 children in the head and 2 parents. Shot another girl. And still to this day cannot even muster so much as a, "I'm sorry. Yeah, I feel bad." That's what you heard from Dr. Proctor. That almost 5 years to the day. Because Proctor is asking him, tell me about what you were feeling about that day. Okay, tell me about it now. Surely now, thinking about Cassidy and what she has gone through, surely you have something. No. Nope. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a decision that we knew when this case came in July 9th of 2014, that we were probably going to seek the death penalty. But we gathered evidence. We talked to a lot of people. And after looking at all of the evidence and talking to all of the people, we realized that yes, the death penalty was appropriate. Not just because of what he put these people through on July 9th, but because of what his life has been. I'm not asking you to make this decision out of anger. I'm not asking you to make this decision out of rage or vengeance or to make you and turn you into a lynch mob. That's not what I'm asking you to do, and that's not what these ladies are asking you to do. We're asking you to look at the evidence and follow the law. And the evidence is clear in this case, that the answer to special issue number 1 is yes, and the answer to special issue number 2 is no. So let's talk a little bit about special issue number 1, what we call that future danger question. That there is a probability that the defendant would commit criminal acts of violence that would constitute a continuing threat to society. And we talked to you about in voir dire, each and every one of us, about the offense itself being enough. That if they're capable of doing this, then they are capable of doing anything. And Kaylin's going to spend some more time talking to you about that. But I'm going to talk to you about the other evidence, the other societies, the other things that we know about this case that tell you to answer that question yes. Because when you think about it, in every single society that he has ever been in, he has committed acts of anger, threats, manipulation, and violence. Think about it. Think about his home life. The woman that he chose to marry, the children that he chose to have. His own flesh and blood. And what did he do to them? He basically abused and tortured them in every way he possibly could for years. He'll leave his 3-year-old son out in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness in the mountains of Alaska. He'll poke his son so hard repeatedly that his son passes out. Not to mention what he put his wife through. To the point that she finds the strength to leave. And she came in here and she talked to each and every one of you. And she explained some of the abuse that she had been through. And you heard about what it took and what she went through and why she stayed. But you also heard some other things. That after she left him, he started to get angry. He started to threaten more and more. It wasn't enough to just threaten her in the marriage. He starts putting together the plans and starts plotting and starts creating the best way to do this. And then you heard from those jail calls. And I just wanted to give you a sample of the jail calls because I did not want to bore you with 200 phone calls. But I give you a sample of those calls, kind of one from each year, so that you can hear what he's talking about, what he sounds like. And what is he talking about in those jail calls? He's talking about stalking Melanie. He's telling his mom exactly where she lives, what she's driving, what she does for a living. And I find that odd, ladies and gentlemen, because he's having that conversation in December of 2014. This is over a year and a half after she's left him. And she has made it abundantly clear to you that she tried to do everything that she could to minimize the amount of information that he had on her and those children. So much so that she had them talk to him in a closet or in a dark space so that he couldn't figure out where they were, and yet he knows all of these details about her, despite her best efforts. And then you hear further jail calls a year later. I don't want to hear about her. With still the angry tone. You hear a call another year where his mom starts describing to him about a divorce that a family friend is going through. And what's his response? She's a spiteful bitch. He is still angry 4, 5 years, 6 now, that she's left him. He's still angry. Criminal acts of violence, continuing threat to society. But not that home life. That's not all that he has done. But wait, there's more. There's his own family, his own parents that have given birth to him, his own brothers and sisters that he has grown up to. And what has he done to them? He has continued to abuse them as well. His father has cancer surgery, and what does he do? He tries to throw him down a flight of stairs because he didn't get him the right fishing license. When he starts verbally abusing and attacking his mom, his sister steps in and says, hey, no, and goes to confront him. So what does he do? He assaults her. He assaults his dad again. And then when his mother makes the ultimate mistake that you can never make with him, which is to take Melanie's side or to confront him, and he nearly kills her by choking her to death. That's his home life. That's his domestic society. He has abused, manipulated, and been violent all throughout that. And make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, that's because of choices that he was making. All of those were individual choices that he continued to make. And then what would he do? Shift the blame. Well, I was tired. I was stressed. It was their fault. Still can't accept responsibility. But surely in his work society, he'd be better there too, right? No. You got to hear from people like Bryce and Todd, Ben. You got to hear about how he could be one of those guys who could go from 0 to 11 like that. But you also know he's the kind of guy that can slow burn and that can plot and can plan. And that's what makes him infinitely more dangerous, because you never know which angry Ron you're going to get. Are you going to get the 11 in an instant, or are you going to get the guy who's been plotting and planning to come after you? In work, his own work society, the places and the choices that he chose to go to, that he chose to get work from, still abusing them, still responding violently, threatening to fuck up coworkers because of his actions of pinning them in and trying to give them unwanted sexual advances. Well, surely in the hospital he'd be better, right? There's a hospital society that's at play here, right? The defense wants you to believe that that's at play. What's he doing in the hospital? He's lying to the doctors, he's manipulating the doctors, he's not following their orders. But that's not enough for him, no. He is still threatening, he's still trying to commit criminal acts of violence. He's threatening to flip over tables, to chunk medicine bottles at people. He's threatening to kill his family. Well, surely the jail society, right? He'll be good there. We've charged him with capital murder. He knows this is a death penalty case. He knows we're watching and listening. He'll behave, right? Nope. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you heard from the detention officer and from the doctors that he's not in general population. He is in an aggravated, secure lockdown facility within the jail. There's not much farther he can go. There's not many other places that he can go that the jail can put him when he misbehaves. He's pretty much stuck in that spot. So when he threatens the detention officer, the jail does the best that they can with what they have to work with. And so they say, no, sir, you don't get your commissary, because don't you know that's the thing that's probably going to irritate him more than anything, is that he doesn't get what he wants when he wants it, because that's what we've learned about him, right? So they take that away from him. But here's how you know the jail took it seriously, is that they removed that detention officer from that part of the jail, and he never goes back. Because they know what he is capable of. Because they know that when he threatens, it's really more of a promise. And they don't want to put Detention Officer Castillo in a position where he might get stabbed from behind, because that guy's on the slow burn. There isn't a single society that he has ever existed in that he is not violently hurt or threatened to hurt somebody. And that is a criminal act of violence that constitutes a threat to society. You have more than enough evidence other than the offense alone. You have more than enough evidence. And that's really and truly what this is about. Your options at this point are that he goes to death row where he can be secure, they can monitor him a bit better, or he goes to general population, where he pretty much has access to everywhere except janitorial stuff and the machine shop. He can pretty much do what he wants, when he wants, with whomever he wants, because they're never going to know who he really and truly is. And if he's behaved this way in every single different society, in every single position that he has wanted to be in, that he has chosen to engage in, and how his response, what makes you think he is not going to behave that way when the day comes? Because you know it will. Even their own expert had to admit it, that he's going to get angry, that he's going to get disappointed, that he's going to get frustrated. It's coming. It's a guarantee. Their expert said it's guaranteed. What their expert doesn't know, but what you know and what they well know, is how he responds when he gets put in that position. How he responds when he is angry, disappointed, and frustrated. If you think he couldn't follow our rules out here, what makes you think that he's going to follow the rules in there? What incentive does he have? Now, the defense seems to want you to believe that he's not a future danger because, well, he's medicated, he's going to be fine. But that sort of falls apart because, one, you can't guarantee he's going to take the meds. And two, does he even really need them? And that's why I brought Dr. Hansen in here, to talk to you a little bit about that. Because yes, if you look in the jail meds in 2015, she continues as Zyprexa. But in 2016, when he hasn't been taking his meds for 4 or 5 months, she takes a closer look. And she really dives into and spends hours with his case file and spends hours looking at him and then talks to him for a very long time. And at the end of that, basically comes to the conclusion, you're lying to me, you're trying to manipulate, and I don't think you need the meds. And we know that that's coming from a place of truth from her, because when you look at those meds, if you so choose, they're over 6,500 pages. If you so choose, you're going to see that he never has another increase in symptom. He hasn't any other crisis, no mental health issues. If he was truly mentally ill, if he truly needed the meds, and he wasn't on them for 4 to 5 months, then you would expect to see some response mental health-wise, right? And he just doesn't have it because he doesn't need the meds. Because his issue is not his mental illness. His issue is his personality. The other reason they seem to want you to think that he is not a future danger is because of this expert that they brought in, Dr. Cunningham. Dr. Cunningham. I don't know, but it sort of felt like a scripted 2-hour infomercial. I was waiting for the moment for them to say, but wait, there's more. And at the end of it, what you truly and fundamentally didn't hear from them, because I was waiting for it in 90 slides, I was waiting for them to say, this man, Ronald Haskell, will not be a threat. But you know what? They never say it because they can't. They're saying, well, guys like him, guys in his sort of situation. Really?
Your Honor, I'd object to that as mischaracterizes the evidence.
Ladies and gentlemen, he got up there because those were the very last questions that Sam asked, and we made sure those were the last questions because they were the ones that we wanted you to remember. He cannot say that he will not commit a criminal act of violence. He doesn't want to admit it, but she forced him, she pinned him down, and he said, no, I cannot guarantee. I cannot tell you with any reasonable degree of medical certainty that he won't commit another criminal act of violence. I can't do it.
Well,
And you
again,
want to know
that
why?
mischaracterizes the evidence. There's nothing to do with medical.
The jury heard the witness testify, and they could go from memory, and you've got the ability to give the testimony whatever way you choose. So I'll let you continue.
You want to know why? Because all of his stuff is academic. It's not real world. He cannot say for certain what this man will do in the real world. You notice nowhere in there can he factor in lack of remorse, inability to accept responsibility. Don't you think that that has something to do with? Because that's what we all know. That's just fundamental human nature. If you want to fix a problem, if you're going to be good, if you're going to really respond to the society that you're in, you're going to recognize your limitations. You're going to recognize that you need the help. You're going to recognize that you've made a mistake. And he is fundamentally incapable of doing that. But here's the other problem. And I'm sure some of you were thinking this when the Dr. Cunningham was testifying. He labeled a list of risk factors for you and claimed it low risk. And what was on those risk factors? His age. He's in his late 30s. He doesn't have any gang affiliations. He graduated high school. He had jobs. He's got community ties. I think it was like low involvement with law enforcement. What's interesting about that, and I'm sure some of you caught on to this, was, ladies and gentlemen, on July 8th of 2014, all those same risk factors were there, the day before the offense. And on July 9th of 2014, when he massacred that family, when he executed them in cold blood, those risk factors were still there. They're still there on July 10th and every day thereafter. So it's great in the ether. It's great in that.
That misrepresents the evidence. It's in context of a prison society, and that didn't exist in July 2014. It's misleading and it's improper argument.
Okay, again, I'll allow the jury to make its own interpretation after having heard the witness. I'll overrule the objection and allow you to continue.
Those risk factors were there. And yet he still did what he did. And I guarantee you, the low risk doesn't provide a whole lot of comfort for these people. As I'm sure it doesn't provide a whole lot of comfort for you, because we know who he is and what he does. For a guy who's really concerned about context, he didn't really care to learn a whole lot about the context, because if he did, then he would have talked to all of the people that have been involved in his life and how he responds to things. Academics is one thing, reality is something else, and we know what his reality is and we know what it will be. We know that he will be a continuing threat to any society that he is in. You know it. The law and the evidence has proved that to you. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if he can't follow the basic criminal rules, theft, assault, murder, if he can't follow the basic common decency and common morality rules, you shot children and called it collateral damage. If he can't even follow the rules of his own religion, he gets excommunicated because of this. What makes you think he's going to follow the rules in prison? You have no evidence to believe that he will. You have a whole lot of evidence to believe that he won't. The answer to special issue number 1 is yes. It's yes today, it was yes yesterday, and it will be yes tomorrow and every day thereafter. So then you're asked to go to special issue number 2. Do you find anything sufficiently mitigating considering everything that you've heard? And ladies and gentlemen, I would submit to you that the question isn't, does his life have value? That's not what this is about. Because unlike him, we all recognize that life has value. And if it was truly about whether or not his life had value, we wouldn't need you, we wouldn't even need to be here. It's about whether or not, based on the law and the evidence, what track he is going to. And I would submit to you, if you really truly think about what is sufficiently mitigating about this case, what sufficiently mitigates Cassidy saying what happened to her? What sufficiently mitigates that poor girl having to come in here, look at him, and tell each and every one of you about her single worst day? What sufficiently mitigates the fact that she will always, in some part of her deep down, still be that 15-year-old girl in that living room? His dyslexia, the fact he was a Boy Scout, he was a good guy in high school? No. They want you to believe it's the mental health, his mental illness. But ladies and gentlemen, you have learned probably way more than you ever wanted to know about mental illness. And you know that his issue is truly his personality disorders, his cluster B manipulative narcissism with antisocial traits. And you learn from the doctors that that can cause depression, because when things don't go his way, when his ego and his self-esteem get hit, he gets depressed. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't dispute the fact that in June of 2013, when Melanie left him, he got depressed. That's a depressing event. But what you have to remember is they left because of his choices and his actions. He is the reason we are all here. He is the reason that we are all united. It is because of him. Ladies and gentlemen, there are people who are truly mentally ill. Absolutely. And they struggle and they fight and they work hard every day. And they make it work as best as they can. And some days are better than others. But it is insulting. It is downright insulting to try for this defendant to claim that his mental illness somehow decreases or reduces his moral blameworthiness. When there are people who are actually struggling with it, who are being honest with their doctors, who are being honest with their family members, who are taking the meds and are doing everything that they can to get better, versus him. And it is replete in the records that he is a poor historian, that he is a poor medication compliance, and that he doesn't really like being honest with the doctors. And when they do confront him, when they do finally get enough information about him, he goes and sees someone else because they're on to him. That doesn't reduce any sort of blameworthiness on him. In my opinion, it's aggravating. Because there are people who are really trying to get it done and trying to really help themselves, and he's not one of them.
Objection, Judge. Her opinion doesn't matter. That's improper argument.
Sustain.
Ask the jury to disregard her opinion.
If you just regard her opinion, it is not testimony in the case, but the state I'll allow you to continue.
Thank you. We knew this day was coming. It was almost 13 weeks ago when we started interviewing jurors. And we talked to each and every one of you. I think we went through about 430 questionnaires to get to you 16. And the reason you are here is because you said, in every which way that we could ask you, that if the appropriate circumstances were there, that you could follow the law, you could follow the evidence, and answer those questions in a way that would result in him getting the death penalty. And now you're here. And Sam and Kaylin and I all had confidence then, and we all have confidence in you now. Because the law and the evidence is clear. That it's yes, and that it's no. And the reason you're here is because you said you could not only take that oath, but you would follow that oath, and we believed you. And we still do. Make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen, you answering those questions yes or no does not make you a killer. It's offensive to even suggest it. It means you're a citizen who is following your oath. It means you are a citizen who is doing your job and looking at the evidence and answering the questions that you've been asked, and only the questions that you've been asked. What was interesting as I was kind of getting prepared for this and I started looking back at all of your questionnaires, almost all of you, when we asked you what made somebody dangerous, what was your best argument for the death penalty, almost all of you told us their mind, their intent. Was it premeditated? Did they put themselves in that position? Did they hurt children? Were there more than one person killed? Every scenario that you were thinking about why you may give the death penalty is this case and more. The one concern that all of you seemed to share in not giving the death penalty was because you wanted the process to be fair and that you wanted to know and be sure that he was guilty. And ladies and gentlemen, they've conceded that to you from day one. Rest assured that when you answer these questions, yes and no, that the process has been fair. The defense hasn't been given a whole lot to work with, but they have done their best. They are excellent attorneys, and it's not their fault that the defendant didn't give them a whole lot. But the evidence in the law is clear. You answering yes and no isn't going to tell anybody in this room anything they don't already know. That he is a future danger, and there is nothing sufficiently mitigating. Thank you.
You may proceed whenever you're ready.
It was easy to kill the Stay family. Do you remember those words? They're not my words. They're his words. It was easy to kill the Stay family. And that's why Special Issue Number 1 is set up and allows you, as jurors, to go back simply on the facts of the case alone to find him a future danger. He has no remorse. Think about that. 5 years after the fact, no remorse for killing this family. That makes him even more dangerous because he's taken no responsibility for his actions. None. So let's talk about the execution of the Stay family. When did this begin? It started with the threats to Melanie. When he told her over and over again, if you ever leave me, I will kill your entire family in front of you. I will make you watch them die. And that started shortly, we know, after he married her in 2002. And what did he do? He isolated her. He kept her away from her family. He made her feel worthless. Until one day, after she saw her son strike out against his little sister and realized she had to stand up to the years of violence, she said no more. And she left. She figured out a way to get out, and she got out. And that angered him. He was losing control. And what did she do? She defied him. She served him with a protective order on July, we know, a year to the date of this offense. July 9th, 2013, at 5:30 in the afternoon. So what did he do? He started planning. He was going to take back control. He knew what he had to do. He was going to be true to his word. What do we know happened when she was packing up that night to flee from him? What do we know his words were from the phone call? Is Katie there? If she's there, she'll pay. Those were his words. Do you remember that from the testimony? Because that's what this was always about. Not vengeance from the state, vengeance of this man. This man, Ron Haskell, is why we're here. Because of the choices and the decisions he made. Because when that check that belonged to his ex-wife came in, he took it and cashed it on June 23rd. June 23rd. And then he waited until he could withdraw it on June 25th. And he fixed his truck, and he got his registration done, and he put his plan into action. We know we went and got the gun, he got the ammunition, and he prepared. And he traveled to Texas. Think about July 9th of 2014. Got to hear about it from Cassidy, how they began their day, how they spent a crafts morning with family, having lunch, enjoying things. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Think about the fear that Cassidy felt when she turned around and she saw the defendant who identified herself as her uncle in the house. That's important because, again, why special issue number 1? So valuable because it depends on the facts of the case itself. He entered that house knowing there was a 15-year-old child in there with 4 younger children and no parents, and he decided to stay. And what did he do? He had them all go sit in the room after he showed Cassidy the gun. And this was not a rage. This was a man in control. He was taking back control. He was following through the words that he had said over and over and over to his wife in that 12 years of marriage. If you ever leave me, I will kill your family in front of you. I will make you watch. I will take them away from you. And he was true to his word. What do we know happened in that room? We know that Cassidy sat on a couch and she comforted Emily, who was so in tune to the emotions and everything that was going on. She told you she rubbed her back, and she told him it was okay. It was going to be okay. And she told you, she asked Ron Haskell and pleaded with him, please don't hurt my family. Please don't hurt my family. As he looked at her and sat there and waited for her mother and father to come home. We know that Cassidy had the presence of mind to introduce Ron Haskell to each of her sisters and brothers. This is Brian. He's 13. This is Emily. She's 9. This is Becca. She's 7. And this is Zach. He's 4. She prayed, and she waited for her parents to come home. And what did she hear? She heard the door, and Brian say, Mom and Dad are home. And she knew she had to keep them quiet. So she said, let's all stay here and play a game. Everyone, let's be quiet while we wait for Dad. And what happened? Katie and Stephen came home to their house, their back door. Your home, the one place in the world you should feel safe. So they went up to that locked door. Katie saw this defendant. And she was so frightened because she knew what he was capable of that she urinated on herself. Think about that. Imagine the fear as a woman not being able to protect your children, your most precious gift. So she goes inside with her husband, and he's in control. He's making true to his word. He is not going to be defied by Melanie or Katie because Katie had to pay. Because Katie was the one who had taken Melanie from Utah to Texas. So what does he do? Tells them to come inside. Katie pleads with him. And she said, your children will be so happy to see you. They'll be so happy you're here. And he tells them, lay down on the ground. And so she tells her children to lay down on the ground. And they do. that family had to be compliant. Stephen had no way of protecting his wife or his 5 children. As a man, you know the most important thing is to be able to protect your spouse, your family, someone you love, a younger brother, a younger sister, your parents. He had no ability to protect himself, his wife, or his children. And so what did Haskell do? Laid him down, just like little ducks in a row. Remember Cassie's words? Those were her words. Laid him down and he counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And at that point, Katie realized what was going on. And she jumped up and she yelled, "No, no," and she fought with him. She tried to do everything in her power to prevent him from what she knew he was going to do, because she had heard the words from her sister, and she knew the threats, and she knew the abuse that Melanie had been through. And she fought. And she paid for it with her life. And what do we know what happened next? We know that Cassidy saw that, and Cassidy put her head down, and she told you she was screaming. We know from the physical evidence that Stephen Stay was not laying on the ground when he was shot. You know from the physical evidence that Stephen was shot straight on and through the side of the head. He was not laying on the ground. I submit to you, he was getting up, trying to fight, protect his family, because you know that from the physical evidence, the autopsy. But he was unarmed. He never stood a chance. And he died. Who was shot next? We know Katie was shot again in the back of the head as she laid down. And we know from the autopsy of Becca, remember Becca? Becca who loved to dance? Becca who told Mariah Davis, "Build me a studio with mirrors so I can have recitals and I can bring my friends." Remember Becca? Remember the autopsy photographs? I'm not going to show them to you again. I'm sure they are seared in your brain. Becca had so much stippling on the side of her face and the stippling in her left eye because she was so close when the gun was fired. Probably based on where she was laying when she looked up and saw her mother being shot. That wasn't even a wound to her. The wound to her went onto the top of her head. And we know, too, that gunshot to the top of her head was not immediately fatal. You know she suffered. You know from the testimony of Sergeant Beck that when he entered that house and he talked to Becca and tried to comfort her, she was alive and she was suffering. But she also died. Brian, sweet Brian, who loved to run and give you the hugs. Brian, who this defendant knew was special needs, who he considered collateral damage. We know from the crime scene photographs, Brian was moving around, and as you look at the crime scene photographs, he's not laying face down. He was moving around at that point, and he was shot, and he died. Emily, who had clung to her sister, who had been comforted, who was so in tune to people's emotions, was also moving. You know that if you look at the physical evidence, if you look at the crime scene photographs, she's not where she was laying when Cassidy had her next to her. She's moving around as he shoots her. And Emily dies. And Cassidy, who has been screaming, who's been shot, knows she has to be quiet. You know she knows she has to be quiet, and it was in the testimony of the EMS, emergency first responders, and the records that Zachary was crying. And he was shot again. But think about Zachary. Think a minute about the brutality, the coldness, the heart of vengeance that a person has to have to shoot a 4-year-old. A 4-year-old child who would never be capable ever of identifying him, didn't know him, 4 years old. You know from the autopsy photographs that Zachary is shot through his shoulder. That's his first shot, and it's not fatal. He would have lived from that shot. But what did Zachary do? In the chaos, in the commotion, in the gunfire, amongst the screaming, amongst shot after shot after shot fired, you know, he scrambles over to his father, because that's what little boys do. Little boys look to their moms and their dads to protect them. And we know that Stephen has fallen back against the couch, and he's laying with his body there, dead. He's gone. But Zachary clings to his father and buries his head behind his shoulder. He's hiding. He's whimpering. He's in pain. He's crying because it hurts. And what does this defendant do? This alone should show you how dangerous he is. What does this defendant do? He walks over so close to that 4-year-old and stands over him crying and points a gun at the back of his head and pulls the trigger. We know how close that gun was to Zachary's head because of the stippling to his scalp. How cold and vengeful do you have to be to take the life of a 4-year-old? To do that? And what happens? He leaves. And as Cassidy lays there, in a house that's been full of laughter and happiness, a house that's always known love, she hears nothing but silence, except for the trickling, like a little brook. And she realizes as she gets up, after she's known she's had to play dead, that she's had to control the pain, but she felt that hand cover her mouth and say, "Be quiet." She knows she has to get up because she knows the rest of her family is in danger. She hears that trickling. It's not a brook. It's Brian's blood. She feels something on her pants. What is it? It's Emily's blood and Emily's brains. And she has to get up. Imagine the horror and the composure of this 15-year-old that had the presence of mind to go to the phone and call for help. Because she knew the rest of her family was in danger. Because he had a plan. He was going to be true to his word. Vengeance was in his heart. And we know from the video cameras, in the dash cam cameras from the car, that when the police were chasing him, when they had their sirens on, their lights running, not once but twice did he go by the house on Anvil. And the first time he pulled in the driveway. And I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that was done with the intent of bringing out more people because he wasn't done. He had stalked them. This was his plan, and you know that from the physical evidence. And when no one came out, Roger and Kelly and Ari and Melanie and the children had already been gone. When no one came out, he took the police on a ride to Drew and Arlena's house. And what do we know from the testimony of Drew? Drew said, we've got to get out of here. Remember Drew's testimony? Cassidy's guardian? And luckily, Cassidy had the ability to call the police, and the police were able to stop him. That in and of itself, that crime, gives you the ability to answer special issue number 1, yes, that he's a future danger. But we brought more witnesses in to talk to you, to show you what a future danger he is. Do you remember the testimony of Bryce Seeholzer and Todd Kingsford? The 2 individuals that worked with him at Urban Hardwoods? Bryce told you, Bryce, who wasn't a threat to the defendant, told you that 3 days after this offense, he wrote the district attorney's office from Utah to find who to contact here. So he could tell you this was the most manipulative person he had ever met in his life. It was a game to him. Bryce wasn't doing anything except his job. And the defendant decided it was important for him to manipulate him, to play with his emotions, to have Bryce convinced and upset and torn up thinking he was going to lose his job. And the defendant was so convincing that even when Bryce went in and talked to Todd Kingsford, his boss, he wasn't convinced that his boss was telling him the truth. That's how convincing he was. He had asked this defendant to be a reference for him. That's how convincing he was. And it was just a game to the defendant. He enjoyed that manipulation. We brought in Ben Williams and Todd Fullerton from Schreiber Foods. Why were they important? Ben told you he responded to a complaint by Ms. Montees where she felt like she was targeted by the defendant. Do you remember that? That she felt like she was going to be run off by the defendant, and then looked into it further and found out he had harassed and threatened Jennifer Jackson. And confronted, he lied and tried to manipulate. Oh, she made that up. It's all in evidence. Why is this important? Because of the level of his manipulation. Defense counsel said, well, you know, if you just give him life without parole, he's going to be locked up year after year of your life. But I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, he will have nothing but time on his hand. He is a vengeful person. It was not by chance that he showed up at Katie and Stephen's home on July 9th of 2014 at 5:30 in the afternoon. It was a year to the date. Remember the old adage, revenge is a dish best served cold? He will have nothing but time with life without parole. He will be among other inmates who will have release dates, G2 individuals. And he can be convincing and charming. Remember the testimony of the Kippens? That's why they were so important. Nancy lived a few doors down from Melanie and had no idea the abuse because Melanie was so fearful she would not share that for fear of more beatings to her or her children. So what do we know this defendant is capable of? We know that he's capable of convincing people and manipulating people. And if you send him the message and give him life without parole, You think he won't work on his revenge? Those jail calls that Lauren played for you? You know he has no remorse. And just like Lauren said, he's been stalking her still. This family has the right to know that he's locked up on death row. They have the right to know that they're safe. They have the right to not have to look over their shoulder every day for the rest of their lives, because he has nothing but time on his hand to manipulate other people, vulnerable people within TDC, to do his bidding on the outside. And he is capable of that. You know that. Ladies and gentlemen, he is a future danger. There is no doubt that this will happen. You need to answer it yes. Then you look at special issue number 2, taking into consideration all the evidence and circumstances of the defendant's character and background. This defendant grew up with every advantage. I want y'all to think about this. Every advantage. He had a mother and father who loved him, siblings who loved him, but he had a rage. He is a fragile narcissist who, when his wife finally stood up to him, that wound was so deep that he could not deal with her defiance of him. Do you remember her words? I actually had them written down, because these were Melanie's words. He convinced me that I'm not worth anything to anybody. And there was a constant promise that if I were ever to leave, that he would make me watch my family die, and I would get nothing. Because if he couldn't have the life that he wanted, then nobody got anything. And he would make sure that I didn't get my freedom, and I didn't get my kids, and I was scared. And it wasn't an option for me to leave without my children, so I continued to stay. Until Katie came to her rescue with the rest of her family. Lauren went through his character and his background. You know the acts of violence that he did against his family. That when James pulled him off of Melanie, he told James, "Don't interfere with my family." That's his character and background. It begins so long ago. And his personal moral culpability, his blameworthiness. What is his blameworthiness? What has he taken away from Cassidy? Cassidy, who learned to play piano with her father. Cassidy, who used to enjoy drying dishes and having conversations with her father. Cassidy, who for 5 years has not had her father's blessing. Cassidy, who will never have the opportunity to walk down the aisle with her father, to have that father-daughter dance. Brian, never have the opportunity to graduate from high school, to go on his mission, to grow up to his potential. Baby Zach, never have the chance to be two hands. Becca and Emily never have the chance to dance in front of Miss Davis's mirrors at the studio that was created for them. She'll never have the chance to pick out her wedding dress with her mother, to paint her mother's right hand. So many things taken away because of him. His personal moral culpability is everything in this case, because it was choice after choice after choice, time after time after time. She was been robbed of this. And every one of them have been robbed of their security. Make no doubt about it. For 5 years, they've waited for this day to come, for you to be entrusted to make this decision. Is he a future danger? Yes. Is there anything sufficiently mitigating? No, absolutely not. There's not one thing. You know the answers in your heart. You know the answers to the questions. You've been entrusted, we believe, in each and every one of you to do the right thing. Give them the security. Answer the questions, yes and no, that everyone can be sure that he never has a chance to manipulate again, to control someone that will have freedom on the outside, to cause this family danger or fear. And I ask as you go back there and think about this, as you think about the brutality of this case, if not now, then when? Thank you.
All right, thank you, counsel on both sides. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, at this time, all the evidence, the court's charge, and the closing arguments of counsel are before you. I'm going to hand to the bailiff the charge, together with a verdict form. They will be left with you in the jury room. Once all members of your jury are present and assembled in the jury room, the case is formally submitted to you, and you may begin your deliberations. During your deliberations, you must not communicate with or provide any information to anyone by any means about this case. You may not use your electronic devices or media, such as phone, laptop, computer, or tablet, to communicate to anyone any information about this case or to conduct any research about this case until I accept your verdict. While you are deliberating, your cell phones and communication devices will be removed from the jury room. You may use these devices during breaks or on recesses, but not to disclose or obtain information about the case or anyone associated with it, not the parties, the witnesses, the attorneys, court officers, or myself. No recording of the jury deliberations is allowed. This includes audio-visual, visual, or audio-visual broadcasts, recordings, or photographs of the jury while the jury is deliberating. The alternate jurors are to be separated from the primary jurors at this time. Please step down from the jury box and accompany the bailiff to the jury room. We stand in recess until the jury has reached a verdict. Thank you, sir.
All rise to the jury.
You may be seated. If trial counsel wants to leave the room,